Well, welcome back. It's This Week in Creationism, and we're looking at episode 50 here. That means 50 times I've sat down here and have thought about what's happened in the world of creationism over the past week or two. What are the big events that have occurred, and how might we interpret what's happening within the world of young earth creationism? I've critiqued articles. We've talked about the sociology of young earth creationism here. And so if you've joined me for any number of those events, I hope that it's been a profitable exercise, and I plan on continuing this series to who knows how many episodes. And this week, we're going to dive into lab-grown mammoth meat. How would young earth creationists react to that? What about living fossils? That's another favorite topic of young earth creationists. This time we'll take a look at ginkgos. And of course, we've got to keep talking about young earth evolution, the young earth evolution series from Answers in Genesis, which continues, and I expect it will continue at least one more week. We've had at least 10 episodes now. This is a series of articles that Answers in Genesis has been publishing to call out what they feel is a dangerous movement within the young earth creationist movement itself, which is why we're so interested in it here as we talk about This Week in Creationism. I will reflect upon that particular series and talk about my plans for the future in terms of interacting with that particular series from Answers in Genesis. We've got all that and a few other things to talk about coming right up. Okay, away we go with episode number 50. And just as I was preparing to record this, I found that Gustic Gibbon channel just talked about this story. I don't want to tell you out there, Erica, that I thought of these same things too, okay? I know you want credit, for saying what you said and what I'm going to say in a moment, but I just want to let you know I had the same thoughts. I guess great minds, right? Think alike. So, Mammoth Meatballs. Go watch Gustic Gibbon's fun romp through this particular article. I'll keep my comments very brief. Answers in Genesis on their Facebook Live and then also on their website have this article, Mammoth Meatballs, coming to your spaghetti soon. And here is their advertisement for their YouTube video. Christians beware, scientists grow extinct animal meat. And notice the bold, extinct animal meat. Is this wrong? Is it wrong to grow extinct animal meat? What do you think when you hear that? What do you think they're going to say? But before I begin talking about mammoth meat, I want to say something that also Erica scooped me on, because she made the same comments about Answers in Genesis YouTube page. The same thing I had been also thinking was going to comment on. So again, she said it a lot better. I'll just briefly comment that Answers in Genesis has come up with and used to all of the secular tools of manipulation to their greatest ability as they have created these thumbnails for their videos recently. They're very bold, catchy, but don't often reflect the true nature of the article itself, and this is really no exception in this particular one. So we get all these types of, don't do this, people are deceived, it's very much like, it's scare tactics, all right? Everything about Answers in Genesis and Ken Ham is really boils down to the use of emotion and scaring people into believing things that they think they need to believe. All right, so back to the article. This is the only part I want to focus on with this Mammoth Meatball article. Okay, what's this all about? Well, an Australian cultivated meat company took a DNA sequence from mammoth muscle protein. So you might be wondering, how did they get this mammoth DNA? Well, we have the entire genome of mammoths. So we have frozen pieces of mammoth carcass that we've been able to extract genomes from and piece together the entire genome of mammoths and some other extinct organisms. So we have certain genes, right? In this case, we have one of the genes for muscle protein. They filled in the gaps with genetic material from living creature. The gaps, well, in some cases, there's because it's ancient DNA and is somewhat decayed, they might not have every single base as they stitch it together, or they might not be completely confident in the call. There could be variation at certain individual locations within the base code. So particular bases are more likely to have been affected by the decay process, and therefore we might not be certain exactly what the code is at certain locations. And so what they're saying is they just took another elephant, which has similar sequence, and they said, okay, well, we'll take the mammoth sequence that we're confident in, and then any place where we're not really exactly sure what the mammoth sequence is, we'll take the elephant sequence and we'll just splice that in and like act like that's the sequence. So they create what they think is the best approximation of what the actual gene sequence was for the mammoth. They take that particular gene, and then what do they do with it? The next step was scientists were to place this DNA sequence in a myoblast stem cell from sheep. So they've taken a stem cell, which is a cell that's capable of, it's basically, you can think of it as like an initial cell that hasn't differentiated into a particular types of cells, and then can divide and grow into and be influenced to grow into different kinds of tissues. In other words, turn on different sets of programs in order for them to become, in this case, muscle tissue. Now, they took, and this is really important to notice, they took myoblast stem cells from a sheep, right? And they put the DNA sequence into that, and these cells began to replicate, and the resulting muscle meat was made into a meatball. All in all, the parent process was ridiculously easy and fast, completed in just a couple weeks. All right, that's believable given today's technology. All right, so you've taken a DNA sequence from a mammoth, which is somewhat partial, and then you've adjusted that sequence by using an elephant sequence. Then you take that particular sequence and you remove the sequence for muscle tissue, this particular gene for making muscle from the sheep genome. You replace it with the mammoth sequence, and then you influence those particular cells to become muscle cells and grow many cells that each express muscle protein. And then that particular protein is used, that giant cell mass is grown as a bunch of meat, right? And then you sculpt that into a meatball and you say, like, this is a mammoth meatball. That's just like, okay. If you just have one gene with a slightly different sequence for that muscle, I'm sure that, I don't know, I can't remember exactly. I didn't even go back to the original paper on this one. You know, I criticize Ken Ham and others for not reading the original article. In this case, I don't even feel like I need to read the original article to make the point I want to make here. But the muscle is composed of a whole bunch of different proteins, right? And so they've replaced one of the proteins, and the rest of the muscle proteins are all sheep proteins. So really, this is a sheep meatball, all right? It's a lamb kebab with a slight alteration of one of its proteins such that that protein is more mammoth-like, but I doubt the differences are really that great. So, okay, whoop-de-doo. It's a nice little kind of fun little, wow, your muscle, this particular meatball has some mammoth gene sequence in it. Now, what did you think I thought when I read this? Where are they going to go with this? I thought exactly what Ginkgo Given thought they were going to do with this particular article, right? She said that she expected them to go on a rant about biotechnology, right? Look what they did here. They took DNA sequence, the code, the information from a mammoth, and then they altered it with elephant DNA. So you're mixing species together there. And then you're taking that and you're splicing it into a sheep cell, which is all sheep genome, but now you're just going to change one of the sheep genome pieces into a mammoth portion. And then you're going to grow that in the lab and make a bunch of tissue, living cells, right? A bunch of living tissue that's composed of elephant, mammoth, and sheep together. And you're going to tell your audience that's what was done. And then what's the next line going to be? Oh, we shouldn't eat mammoth meat because we don't really need to grow lab-grown meat because we have plenty of meat in the world, and people just want to make lab-grown meat because why? Because they're afraid the environment is getting too warm and we need to protect the environment, and cows are producing too much methane, and all the different tropes about environmentalism and climate change. And so they spend a whole bunch of time criticizing climate change as if it's because of climate change that we're trying to make lab-grown meat, and I'm sure there are those that are marketing lab-grown meat as environmentally friendly. And therefore, really to capitulate to eating a mammoth meatball is to capitulate to these modern environmentalists when it's completely unnecessary because God gave us actual animals to eat in their native condition rather than having to generate them in a lab. There was nothing, I mean, like Erica said, she expected them to go on a rant about altering DNA from two different kinds of organisms. What are we doing? We're mixing two kinds of organisms. Aren't there Levitical laws about mixing things together? But no, they didn't say anything about that. It was all about climate change. After that, no hint in their description here that they're actually questioning the biotechnology, the taking a gene from one organism and sticking it in another. Now that's a whole complicated topic, and I've addressed that at different times, and there's a lot of complicated things to talk about there. But I find it interesting that whenever Answers in Genesis has a chance to make a statement about bioengineering, they manage to find a way to avoid it. And so given Ken Ham's complete dedication to calling out that which is untrue and being all right, willing to go to the floor for what's right, he obviously doesn't have either a strong opinion on this, doesn't actually believe it's wrong, and thinks this is just a tool that God's given us to be able to manipulate organisms. And I have seen other young earth creationists who will make that argument that they've given, as created beings and they made in the image of God, as creators, we're allowed to use his creation and manipulate it in ways, as long as we're manipulating it for good. Obviously, sin causes us to manipulate it for evil at other times. But that we should be allowed to use these tools and we can mix and match genes from different organisms with others. I think that's a really dangerous, I find, no, I don't necessarily think that's dangerous myself, but what I think is, I find it a little interesting that young earth creationists they're not as willing to talk about this particular topic very much. And I think that they just know it's very, very controversial. So in this case, I think Ken Ham is trying to avoid controversy, and his colleagues, by not mentioning this component of this particular aspect of these stories, like mammoth meat. I just found it peculiar that there was no comment at all about biotechnology, and it was all about environmentalism. Okay, let's move on. Oh boy, young earth evolution. The hit pieces keep coming. And, at one time I thought, should I call it a hit piece or not? But I don't see how I can not call these hit pieces, especially since this week's article was about Todd Wood. And last week's article was about Todd Wood, and 6 weeks ago was about Todd Wood, and it's just one constant. It's just we're going after Todd Wood big time. I am not going to go through this article, and right now I'm working on. Really, I'm still sitting back trying to take in the entire series, and think about what the response should be, and. When I say that, I mean, what should the response be from someone like me? How do I critique these particular articles? I'm most interested in critiquing them from the sense of what's happening in the world of creationism. How do these articles fit within the history, and how do I think they're going to shape the future of young earth creationism? What do I think is the real purpose of these articles? And eventually, of course, I think we're also going to have to address who the author of these articles are, and what that means for what Answers in Genesis is, how far they're willing to go, and who they're willing to be associated with in order to generate this kind of material. So I guess the thing is, stay tuned. I'm going to probably devote a couple separate videos to the analysis of this particular series. And then I will go back and revisit something that I've talked about a lot just a couple years ago, and that is what I call the rise of the new creationists. And I will recover sort of what I predicted about the new creationist and where I thought young earth creationist was going in terms of how it was, I'll say, fracturing somewhat, but also new directions it was taking. And then we'll compare it to this particular series, which directly confronts what I call the new creationist. And we'll see how well did I do with my predictions, and then how am I going to adjust my thinking going forward? And that's really what I'm contemplating right now. And that's why I don't want to say too much at this moment, because the series isn't done, and I kind of want to get the feeling from the whole series and then have enough time to think about it before I sort of present my thoughts to you. All right, so let's move on. I stay away from the culture war stuff, right? I'm just trying to stick with young Earth creationism as the young Earth creation science part of it. But it's almost impossible to separate Answers in Genesis from culture wars and cultural truths that Ken Ham is interested in promoting, and I would say more interested in promoting than his scientific creationism, which I think is at this point is just a side issue for him. It's just a ploy to get people interested in listening, right, and coming to the museum and so forth. It's like, let's talk about dinosaurs. People love to talk about dinosaurs, but really we're not going to talk about dinosaurs. We're going to talk about all this other cultural stuff. And so Ken Ham has been pumping out one after another, either tweets or Facebook or both, long form articles, which I think are sort of like trial flags to see how people react to them. And then eventually most of these end up on the actual Answers in Genesis website as articles. And he has to make a comment on almost anything and everything he sees these days. Seems like he can't help himself. So this was in response to the school shooting in Nashville at a Christian school. And I'm not going to read all this. I have just 2 points to make. He talks about, we've seen a number of extremely concerning headlines, such as trans activists are calling for more blood in the Nashville shooting. Another stated, blah, blah, blah. There was a graphic posted that no one seems to know for sure if it's an April Fool's Day prank or real that advertised, blah, blah, blah. Trans Day of Vengeance. Maybe it's both. Right? He's going through and he's repeating like the names and titles of different. Where does he see this stuff? Here's my problem with what Ken Ham is doing, and how this type of information is amplified and this isn't just Ken Ham. This is the way that our social media works these days. But Ken Ham would say that our kids are a product of the social media that they do? That they read, that they imbibe, right? And he would say that junk in, junk out. Well, here's the thing. I can tell Ken Ham, it spends a lot of time on Twitter with people that he follows. And then he also spends time on places like Rumble and other areas. All right. No, not Rumble. Like True Social or Getter or something like that. He has accounts on these other social media sites where there's a lot of extremism. Right. And he gravitates to these types of things. So that's what he is seeing. And so when he presents this then to his audience, it makes it sound like this is mainstream reactions to these types of things. Like this is what all liberals or all Democrats or all whatever actually believe and say, when really he has put himself into an environment where he hears the most extreme stuff. It's sort of like if you put yourself into it's like I've put myself into an environment where I hear extreme stuff on the right, and I thought, well, that's everyone who are friends of mine that are Republicans and so forth. If I ascribe to them every single thing I saw that some other ultra-right MAGA, person was saying, and I said, oh, they're saying that, you must also believe that. Well, then I really would have a very warped view of the average person who I sit down and talk to. Ken Ham is not grounded in reality, and part of that is because he's enveloped in his own environment where he is protected. He doesn't really have conversations with people of different viewpoints, and he listens to only particular news sources because all he ever does is quote and talk about news sources that are giving him a very tilted view of things. Okay, I'm going way down too many politics here. Said I don't want to stay out of the culture stuff, but you get the idea here. Ken Ham is presenting a very narrow view as if it is the common view, as if it's a larger view. Now he will come back and say, well, sure, maybe only a few people say this, but this is the slippery slope, right? Few people say this, pretty soon everybody's going to believe that. We could do that with all kinds of other views he agrees with and say that will also become the common view too. And then over here, and just to show you how Ken Ham's mind works, over here on the other side, on the right side here, that first paragraph, you see, and of course, and I'm not getting into the gun debate, just making an important point. So now he's going to tell you he's not getting into the gun debate. He's just going to make an important point. Many claim guns were the problem, instead of looking at the fact that the person using gun that carried out this tragic crime, right? He's not getting into the gun debate, but what he's going to do is he's going to repeat a phrase that identifies himself with a particular side of the gun debate. Right? I'm not taking particular sides here. I'm not expressing a particular opinion myself. I'm just noting that he's saying he's not part of the gun debate, but he is, because he does try to stay away from really controversial topics that he knows that even some of his followers will probably disagree upon. On the other hand, he's also signaling, right? He's signaling to most of his audience, this is what you think, and I'm going to make that important point so you understand that I also think that way. And that particular, what he says is expressing a particular point of view on the gun debate. Anyway, that's the kind of stuff that if you follow Ken Ham, you're reading this kind of stuff every day. And remember, he has a huge influence, right? He's got hundreds of thousands of people that read and amplify his material. And so he is very much a leading news shaper, right? An opinion influencer, right? Certainly not a journalist, but he is an opinion influencer, like certain other cable channels would call themselves, right? He's here to influence people, but what he's influencing with is highly cherry-picked, skewed view of the world, because he doesn't have a good grasp of the typical person, really. He is very much become closer and closer and closer associated to a very narrow point of view, which then removes his ability to see the breadth and have a better understanding of these topics. All right, let's stop. Let's move on. Ginkgos, a remarkable living fossil from creation.com. With no evolutionary change over claimed hundreds of millions of years and possessing a complex genome, the ginkgo is totally baffling to Darwinists. I love how all these articles always say it's a complete mystery. It's totally baffling. I can't understand. Oh, there's nothing baffling here. Ginkgos challenge evolutionists because they are unique trees that do not appear to be related in any evolutionary sense to any living or extinct tree. Well, they certainly do appear to be related to other gymnosperms. They have many characteristics and features of them, and although creationists will call upon the creation orchard and say they're all created separately, and so they have separate origins, no one's denying that they aren't trees, and therefore, in an evolutionary scenario, you can't say that they're related to them. Professor Peter Crane, when studying a stone slab containing ancient ginkgo plant leaves, wrote that the stone slab is enough to suggest the great antiquity of the ginkgo lineage. Well, I agree. Ginkgos have been around for a long time in a similar condition that they are today, all right? But it raises still more fundamental question. Where did the ginkgo come from? He speculated on some possibilities in his book, Ginkgo, the tree that time forgot. The current conclusion is that the first ginkgo in the fossil record was very similar to the modern ginkgo. Actually, that's not quite accurate, depending on what the word similar means. And this is the rub with all these articles. Similar, no quantification of what similar is. The fact is they were initially and individually fully formed, as were the dinosaurs during the creation week. Okay, once again, this article boils down to, when we look in the fossil record, we can identify ginkgos. And there don't seem to be any transition fossils from something not a ginkgo to a ginkgo. Therefore, the evidence is that they just suddenly appear in the fossil record, so therefore they were created separately. This argument's been used thousands of times by young Earth creationists. Nothing novel here. I'm just going to point this out. Here are some reconstructions of leaves of seed-bearing structures from 3 different extinct ginkgos, right? And each one of these are, and you can see the names of them. This one up here is ginkgo up in the top left-hand corner. But it's not the Ginkgo biloba, which is the species today. And then there are 2 other genera, and they're united by similar fruit structures, but they aren't exactly the same. And there are multiple other species of ginkgo in the fossil record. So there is the ginkgo species alive today, and it's been around for potentially a long time. So maybe all these other types of things that are ginkgo-like, because they aren't exactly ginkgos. You know, there are other types of trees that have similar fruiting structures. Mostly what we have from ginkgos are the leaves. And so, yes, the leaves have a similar shape. But the article does what most of them do in young Earth creation. They say, oh, there's been no change. And just look at these, ones from the Jurassic, right? The Middle Jurassic. There aren't any modern Ginkgo biloba. There isn't anything back then that looks like today's ginkgo tree. So ginkgos have changed. And these may be some of the ancestors of today's ginkgos. All right, or maybe they're separate lineages. But probably they represent a group of variation that existed back in the Jurassic, from which some of those have evolved into the present day one. So don't say that there's been no evolutionary change. All right, even if you want to look at the leaves and say the leaves haven't changed very much, nothing about evolutionary theory says leaves have to change over millions of years. You really need to look at the bark. You need to look at the anatomical, the xylem and the phloem. You need to look at the fruits especially and the flowers. Oh, sorry, no flowers because this is a gymnosperm. You need to look at the reproductive structures. Right, and if you looked at those things, for which a lot of those we don't have fossil record from, it's hard to say that they're exactly the same back then as they are today. This is just yet another case of there is plenty of variation in the fossil record, and the farther back you go, the more different they look. And so if you want to start talking about like, well, what are these related to? Which specific version of other trees back in the Jurassic are they related to? Well, there are other trees in the Jurassic that are not that far off from something like this. And our molecular studies also suggest that ginkgos are very, very old because they have not shared a common ancestor for a very long time. And because when you start looking at things that are 250 to 400 million years old, it gets kind of hard to figure out just from modern genetics how they're related. So it's not surprising that ginkgos are a little bit hard to place in the phylogeny of all different types of gymnosperms. All right, so yeah, ginkgos have really cool fruits, but those are not actual fruits. All right, those are naked seeds that have a fleshy outer covering on them. And then there's the classic ginkgo leaf there. Ginkgo apodes, that's a reconstruction on the right-hand side of an ancient ginkgo tree. That was we call a different species. Again, these are morphological species types. We can't test this with like, are they reproductively isolated from one another? Because we can't cross these two together because you can't take fossil species and resurrect them and then see if they actually can mate with today's species. So in that sense, we can't really know the answers to some of these questions about exactly how related these are or whether these are different species or not. All right, last item for the day. And this is just, I just saw this as a snapshot, and it's actually the prelude to a small video. But I don't want to even talk about the video. We'll just talk about how Answers in Genesis presents this. So here they have the ability for these small observable variations to occur in real time within a species is often called microevolution. This is where it starts to get a little tricky for the average person. Okay, microevolution. And what he's going to go on to explain is that microevolution is these small-scale changes within a species. The reason why Answers in Genesis folks are confused and why their followers are confused because they just use the word species here. And what they really meant to say, I'm pretty sure, was kinds. Because they think that many species, some cases, are all part of the same kind. And they would say the change from one species to another, from one hawk type to another hawk type, is microevolution. That's how they call it. And I agree, that's where it gets a little tricky. It's a little tricky for the average young Earth creationist follower to figure out where does microevolution end and where does macroevolution begin? Because they define microevolution as all kinds of changes that happen within kinds. By the way, in typical evolutionary biology parlance, you would say that microevolution are small-scale changes or changes in low frequencies over time within populations or within species. And if you have enough accumulated change that creates different species that are now reproductively isolated or at least ecologically and reproductively and ecologically isolated, that kind of change to having unique morphological characteristics that are distinct between the two groups, right? That is the point at which you're reaching, talking about something like macroevolution, although there's lots of different definitions of these things. But nonetheless, macroevolution is certainly the pattern of changes of species, say in the canines, where you have 35 different species of living canines. The pattern of how those came about from different splits of different species is macroevolution, a large-scale pattern change over time. But that's not what Answers in Genesis calls that. They call that microevolution. So it is confusing, all right? And it does get a little tricky because determining where microevolution can't become macroevolution is a difficult thing for young Earth creationists. And I don't really, every time I have conversations with young Earth creationists who read young Earth creationist literature, and you get into any depth at all, they become completely confused about exactly what species are, what kinds are, how much change is actually allowed. And that's an area of active study among young Earth creationists that needs a whole lot more study if they're going to ever come to a resolved explanation of these types of things. So, yeah, kind of a short episode today, just a couple items. Again, the most dramatic thing happening in Earth creationism is this whole young Earth evolution spat that's going on. And I'm going to address that, as I said before, in separate videos. I will do like a small promo for a video I just recorded. Tuskless elephants aren't what some creationists think they are, in which we're going to talk about some confusion that a young Earth creationist has about how tusklessness is being formed or selected for in elephants. And the nature of selection-mutation balance. So look for that coming up probably right after this particular video. All right, that's it for today. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.